Chapter 1. Wilton Abbey, December 1075. It had been so easy to take it. As Wilton Abbey's bell tolled for her dead aunt's midnight vigil, everyone, priests, nuns, novices, postulants and girls, passed through the archway into the chill of St. Edith's chapel. Gunhild hovered near the back of the gathering. When the nuns' choir began to sing the first plain song, she lifted a candle from a niche close to the doorway, cupped her free hand around it, and slipped out into the fosse. Cloisters. She hurried along a pathway through overhanging shadows until she reached her aunt's apartment, rooms that were set away from the main abbey buildings, elegant as befitted a queen, albeit a dowager queen. Pushing open the doors, she crept into the reception hall, crossed the dead queen's antechamber, the great bedchamber, and finally into Aunt Edith's vast wardrobe. I must find it because when I do, I shall have a suitable garment to wear when I leave this place. I must take it before it is given to that dwarf, Queen Matilda. Gunhild set her candle in an empty holder on a side table a little distance from the hanging fabrics and stepped into the space between wooden clothing poles. Frantically, her fingers began fumbling amongst Aunt Edith's garments. Which one was it? No, not those woolen gowns, nor the old linen ones either. No, look again. She moved along a rail by the wall, fingering linens and silks, until finally she found what she sought at the very end. Reaching out with both hands, she touched the overgown, pulled it down, and took it out into the candlelight. Its hem was embellished with embroidered flowers, heartsease or pansies, in shades of purples and blues with centers of glistening pearls. Her aunt had worn it when Gunhild had first traveled to be with her in Winchester for the Pentecost feast of 1066, just after Aunt Edith's husband, King Edward, had died, and Gunhild's father was crowned king. Their family had risen, and he had wanted his 9-year-old daughter to be prepared by her aunt for an education fit for a princess, to learn foreign languages, play instruments, and embroider. She had remarked then to Aunt Edith that heartsease was her favorite flower, and Aunt Edith had lifted her hand, smoothed it along the silk, and said, "One day this dress will belong to you." Gunhild peered closer, examining the clusters of tiny flowers, noticing how perfectly they were edged with gold and silver thread. Her eyes darted about the fabric. There were no moth holes. The green silk dress was as fresh as it had been 10 years before. She laid the overdress on a stool, returned into the depths of the wardrobe, and with both hands shaking, lifted down its paler linen undergown. With a cursory glance, she saw that it, too, remained in perfect condition. Make haste and hurry away. She folded the overgown into the linen shift and pulled her mantle over them both. Carefully closing the wardrobe's leather curtains, she blew out the candle and sped from the apartment, fleeing back through empty cloisters to the postulants' building. Pausing to catch her breath, Gunhild pushed open her cell door with her back, slipped inside and spun around. Her every muscle tensed with fear. Eleanor was standing in the middle of the room. "Christina sent me to find you." Eleanor, who had been her friend since she had entered Wilton Abbey, broke off. "What, by the Virgin's halo, are you hiding under your cloak?" Gunhild pulled out her bundle and dropped the garments onto her cot. Eleanor held up the silk overgown and then dropped it onto the tiles as if it were poisoned, her face pale with shock. "This," she gasped. "Where? Did you get it?" "I took what is mine by right," Gunhild said in a quiet voice. "You stole it." "No, I did not. My aunt promised that one day this gown would belong to me. All her clothes will be shortened to fit the dwarf queen. And anyway—" Gunhild glanced down at her grey postulant's robe, and her hand flew to the hideous black cap that Christina, the assistant prioress, forced her to wear. "I need something better than these." "Whatever for?" "You will know soon enough, Eleanor, I promise." Gunhild scooped the gown into her arms, folded it, and placed it back on her coverlet beside its linen undergown. Her mind working quickly, she searched around her chamber for a suitable hiding place. The garment chest had a strong barrel lock and a key, though she rarely secured it. But now, she crossed the room, flung open the coffer's lid, and bent down. For a moment, she inhaled the pleasant scent of cedarwood chips and felt around with both hands, rooting amongst her plain linen until she plucked out a green fillet embroidered, with a golden pattern and a pair of red deerskin slippers decorated with twisting, fire-spitting Godwin dragons. Both had been gifts from Aunt Edith for her 16th birthday. She lifted the headband, turned it around and around in her hands, and faced Eleanor again. These belong to the daughters of my family. My aunt gave them to me to keep, not to my mother who is in a convent, nor to my sister Thea, who is far away in the lands of the Russ, but to me, she said, clutching her hands together so tightly her finger bones felt as if they would crack. No, Eleanor, the real sin is to imprison one of us in this abbey, to expect her to wear dull gowns day upon day, and order her to wed with God. Eleanor leapt up from the bed and pointed at the headband. Where in heaven's name would— You wear that? Christina will find you out. No one is forcing you to take vows. You chose your own path. You have broken 2 vows already, obedience and poverty. If the abbess finds out— She caught her breath and rasped, "Oh, for heaven's sake, Gunhild, take them back to your dead aunt's rooms and leave them there for Queen Matilda before you break the 3rd. And that is unlikely here," Gunhild complained, and tucked the fillet and slippers back in the coffer. "No, I shall risk Christina's fury." She plucked the gowns from the cot, laid them neatly on top of the fillet and slippers, and covered the lot with 2 everyday shifts. Turning back to Eleanor, she said, "Christina must not find out. Please say you will not tell her. Besides, I have not yet taken any vows, nor shall I take them. I have changed my mind. My father, King Harold, remember how he was once King of the English? Well, I shall never forget it, nor that the dwarf queen's husband, that bastard William, killed him on the field at Senlac. I shall never forget that King William stole our kingdom." She gasped for breath, almost choking with fury. "My father never intended me for the church. He sent me to serve my aunt, to learn to read, write, and embroider. Now Aunt Edith is gone to God's angels. There is nothing left for me here. I intend to be free." "Gunhild, how will that happen?" Eleanor's voice was very, very quiet. Gunhild breathed deeply and said, "Eleanor, I am a princess. When my knight comes to claim me, I shall be waiting for him in that dress." She climbed up onto the chest and slipped her hand behind the statue that sat in the wall niche above it. She felt around for a small key and grasped it. Carefully, so as not to knock over her plaster St. Edith, she climbed off the clothing chest. Kneeling on the cold tiles, she secured the barrel lock with a loud clink, stood on the chest again, replaced the key, and set the statue back into its original position. Looking over her shoulder, she called down, "Now it is hidden, and only you and I know where. Promise me you will not tell." "I will not. Gunhild, your secret is safe at least. On earth, if not in heaven." As Gunhild jumped from the chest, Eleanor reached over and caught her hand. "Hurry, or you really will be discovered, and I hope God forgives you, because if Christina finds out, she will not." "Bah, I am not afraid of Christina." Gunhild hesitated momentarily and added, "No, not a bit, even though I know she will beat me with her rod through the cloisters and lock me in the ossuary if she ever discovers my intention to escape." She reached out for Eleanor's hand. "Thank you. You are a true friend." Eleanor drew her close and whispered, "Be careful what you wish for, Gunhild. Now let us slip back into the chapel before the dragon comes looking herself." Hand in hand they sped back to the novice, stalls in the chapel where they took their places amongst the other postulants and novices and bowed their heads in prayer. The vigil was drawing to its end. The bell in the abbey church was already tolling. It would only be a few hours until prime. After morning prayers, Gunhild was to travel to the funeral in Westminster Abbey because she was the only surviving Godwin heiress dwelling in England. But once Aunt Edith's royal funeral was over, she would return to Wilton to be buried alive as deeply as the winter that was gathering about the cloisters. Touching the coarse hemp of her plain gown, she sighed. No knight would ever look at her dressed in raiment as pale as the shroud that covered her aunt's once lovely form. As Gunhild's eyes swam with tears, she wiped them away from her cheeks. Using a corner of her cloak, she whispered into the candle smoke, "Aunt Edith, forgive me. I want to be of the world, not apart from it." Chapter 2. Westminster, December 1075. And the Lady Edith passed away in Winchester 7 days before Christmas, and the king had her brought to Westminster with great honour, and laid her with King Edward, her lord. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, translated and edited by Michael Swanton, 2000. Their long wagon clattered into the palace courtyard, almost too late for Aunt Edith's funeral. The Palace of Westminster was smaller than Gunhild remembered. Even so, the new church still drew her awed gasp as she peered out at it from the nuns' litter. She recollected how Aunt Edith's smooth face had become riveted with anxious gullies on the night that the king, Gunhild's uncle, collapsed at the Christmas feast of 1065. He had lingered in a shadowy place between worlds for days, rambling. Terrible prophecies, foretelling, to those gathered at his bedside, of fire, sword, and destruction. It was this fear that drove Uncle Edward to give care of his kingdom to Harold of Wessex, her father, who was the strongest of all the earls. After all, the other earls had elected her own father to be king because the obvious choice, young prince. Edgar, who had been born in exile, was foreign to their people and was inexperienced. During that long-ago Christmastide, the freezing palace had seemed to creak and groan with the weight of her aunt's sorrow. She remembered Uncle Edward's funeral on the Epiphany, and how, on the same day that he was interred, her father had been crowned King Harold II. On that day, she had become an 8-year-old princess. Now, 10 years on, she climbed from the wagon into the icy courtyard to stand in her thin woolen mantle amongst the nuns from Wilton waiting to join her aunt's funeral procession. It would move in a stately manner out of the palace, across the snowy courtyard, and into the long pillared aisle through the minster's west door. She was not a princess today, of course. As she surveyed the noble Norman ladies, clad in rich furs and gathering around the palace yard in elegant groups, she could not help but long for someone to love her, someone to free her from Wilton and sweep her into her own elegant existence in the world beyond Abbey walls. She shivered and watched, her face as unsmiling as those all around her. King William, who led the procession, looked ahead sternly. The tiny queen who stepped neatly beside him owned an alabaster complexion as white as polished ivory. Gunhild knew that she was, of course, far beneath the dwarf queen's notice. At last, the Wilton nuns slipped into place to join the walk to the cathedral, and Gunhild took up her position alongside Christina, behind the knights and nobles, bishops and monks. As they moved forward over the palace's icy yard towards the church, the monks' censers swung back and forwards through sharp winter air in a slow, methodical rhythm. After what seemed an endless time, they were at last crowding into the nave of the great minster. Others pressed in behind them, and Gunhild found herself moving forward with a crowd of mourners all about her. They thronged every space from the altar to the west door. She could smell the musty damp rising off their furs, hardly masked by the heavy oily perfumes that they wore to conceal the stink of their sweat. Her throat was irritated by the pungent smoke from the golden swaying censers, and she began to cough. Christina glared at her through bead-like jackdaw eyes that missed little. Gunhild clamped her hand to her mouth. Turning away from the censer-swinging monks, she tried to breathe slowly. In, out, in, out. Try not to inhale the sickly perfume. Worse inside than out. Just breathe. As she recovered, a deep sadness overcame her, and her mind wandered. Aunt Edith was telling her to sit by her charcoal fire on a stool, teaching her to read from an illustrated book with tales of animals, stags with thorny crowns, red foxes, and long-eared hares. Shaking herself from such memories, she focused hard on where she was now. Looking about the nave, she began to scan the somber faces of others. So many people had gathered at Westminster. Did they really care about the dead old queen who had straddled two worlds, the beautiful world she had known before the great battle and that of the Norman conqueror? How could these strangers possibly care about her clever aunt? She closed her eyes, and by squeezing them tightly shut, she captured an older recollection. This time, she saw her mother embroidering a fine tunic with golden thread. It was for her handsome warrior father, Earl Harold, in their happy time before he was king. Perhaps her mother, the once lovely Edith Swanwick, was here too. She opened her eyes and glanced around again, peering hard through gaps in the groups that crowded the nave. Her mother was not there. So, they never invited my mother. I am still not permitted to speak with my mother, in case we plan together, to bring my brother Godwin back from Denmark and help him to kingship. Aunt Edith never allowed me to write to her. For your own sake, Gunhild, Aunt Edith had once said when she had begged to write to her mother, forget you ever had a mother. I am your mother now. Gunhild knew the true reason. Simple. The bastard king is afraid of my mother ever since her part in the rebellion at Exeter. She is like the rest of the mothers of Hastings, shadows in the corners. This is what becomes of passing your days on your knees in prayer. Gunhild chased another memory. Ulf, her little brother, was still a hostage at King William's other court in Normandy. He had been fleet of foot and so filled with mischief. They had glided together over frozen ponds on bone skates and climbed tall, spiky trees on the estate of Raridfellow that winter before her father had sent her to Wilton for her education. She felt herself smiling through damp eyes until a moment later a finger was prodding her, pushing her forward. Christina was hissing in her ear. Wake up, look down. This is a funeral, not a wedding. 4 nuns stood in a tight group around Christina, their sweat as stale as rotting fish, their breath foul. Gunhild looked away from them and swallowed. She glanced across at the other side of the nave. A knight who stood by a statue of St. Mark's lion was looking straight at her, watching her. As she caught his eye, he turned to the canons who were gathered about the coffin, chanting prayers, helping Aunt Edith to heaven. Had he really looked her way, or was her imagination tricking her? Gunhild, what are you doing now? Christina pinched her arm. Gunhild bit her lip to stop a retort. Look down, girl. This behavior does not become the daughter of a man who was once a king of the English. I'm just trying to find my mother, Lady Christina. Christina hissed. She would not be invited. Sweat trickled down Gunhild's back and soaked into the coarse linen she wore under her gown. She must find fresh air before she vomited in front of them all. Excuse me a moment, Gunhild clapped her hand to her mouth and turned around, almost knocking the nun behind her, over in her haste to escape. She pushed back through the great gathering of nobles, weaving a way around groups of strangers until she sensed clearer air from an opened side door. She ran out into a small courtyard and retched. She used her sleeve to wipe the spittle from her mouth and leaned against the stone wall, gulping cold air. Once she felt a little better. She edged her way back along the wall. The same knight stood there with his back to her, hovering just inside the doorway, blocking her return. He shifted his stance and glanced out. From her place of safety, she observed him through the slits in the stone tracery of the portico. She realized that she had seen him before. His red hair was less bright than when she had last observed him during the nightmare year when other women of her family fled England. She had only been 10 years old and had chosen to stay at Wilton with Aunt Edith. Many foreign ambassadors and great knights had visited Aunt Edith. This red-headed knight, known to them then as Count Alain of Brittany, had lingered deep inside her memory. Her mother had behaved in a scandalous manner, agreeing to wed the knight, then breaking her promise. Aunt Edith had been angry and had never mentioned her mother's name again. Momentarily, the knight stood still as the effigies that graced the side chapels inside the minster, and watching him slowly scan the courtyard, she felt a delicious stirring of something she longed for, his world. He moved out of the doorway, strode around the portico, and looked straight down at her. Trying to reclaim her dignity, she stood up, swept her hand down her gown, and pulled her rough mantle closer. "Are you unwell, my lady? Can I fetch someone? One of your order, perhaps?" She did not reply. He spoke again. "Who cares for you? Can I find that person for you? Ma petite, you are a novice, yes?" Stretching up to her full height, she found her tongue. She fixed him with as stern a look as she could manage. "No, my lord, I am not yet a novice, nor do I ever intend to be one. I am Gunhild, a daughter of King Harold of the English." "I thought as much. Lady Gunhild, you are grown since I last saw you in Wilton. You must be— what age?" "I am 18 years, and I am quite recovered." "Thank you. Please allow me to pass." The knight scrutinized her face. "Is he looking for my mother in my countenance? My mother was right to deny him, of course. This man could never replace my father." He said, his voice so low she hardly heard, "And at 18 you should be wed." He bowed, inclined his head, and moved aside to allow her passage. "You are bold, knight." She looked up at him, refusing to let his remark pass unnoticed, even though she agreed. She should indeed have a husband. "And you are fair, my lady. I mean it as a compliment." At that, Gunhild pushed past him into the church and hurried back through the crowd. She turned at a pillar and glanced back, her eyes searching hard. For him, but others had closed him in, and he was gone. When she returned to her place, Christina tugged her mantle and she fell to her knees. They rose again as everyone was beginning to leave, drifting towards the great door, following after the King and Queen and Lanfranc, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Bishop of London, monks, nuns, and nobles. No matter how hard she peered through gaps in the great gathering, she could not see the red-headed knight, and, by the Virgin, she could not remember his name. "Where were you, Gunhild?" Christina said. Gunhild pointed to an alcove close to the narrow doorway. "Praying to Our Lady for my aunt's soul." The lie slipped from her tongue as easily as the liturgy she knew by rote. "Sooner you are shriven the better, my girl." Christina took Gunhild's arm and hurried her back out into the brightness of day. Turning to her group of nuns, she dropped Gunhild's elbow and said, "There are too many temptations at a funeral feast. Prioress Winifred will see to our needs in the women's hall, and there we shall rest." With that, she turned on her heel. Dutifully, the 4 nuns of Wilton followed, as Gunhild trailed behind them. Glancing backwards, Gunhild now saw that the knight was leaning on his sword by the choir stalls, once again observing her. Feeling a flush of color creep up her neck, she drew her mantle hood close and hurried after the others. Chapter 3. Wilton Abbey, Winter, 1076. While snow and hail and frost all fall together, the heart's wounds seem by that yet heavier. The Wanderer, a choice of Anglo-Saxon verse, edited by Richard Hamer, 2006. "Gunhild, I must speak with you and with Eleanor," Christina announced after nonce on a snowing day in January. The year's first snowfall always reminded Gunhild of how her grandmother, Githa, had told them of how a white raven who had belonged to the Norse god Odin scattered feathers in the cold of winter, feathers that fell to earth as snow. Obediently, bowing their heads, they trailed behind Christina through the icy cloisters, exchanging anxious glances. Gunhild wondered what was waiting for them. Had they not been diligent enough? Would Christina punish them for some silly misdemeanor with more time on their knees in the chill chapel in prayer, finger-pricking embroidery, or perhaps the worst of all punishments, fumigating blankets for the Abbey's guest house? She shuddered. The extra blankets were stored in fusty chests where fleas mysteriously multiplied in their woolen seams. She huddled into her mantle and longed to climb the twisting stairs behind the cloisters to the scriptorium where a basket of coals glowed in a charcoal brazier. There she could lose herself in drawing tiny acanthus leaves, which she loved to touch with gold. Tucked away in an alcove set aside for her use, she drew and colored little figures with such talent that visiting monks remarked that they could never better her work. She trampled snow as she plodded behind Eleanor and Christina, escaping in eye. Her mind into her miniature depiction of the wedding at Cana with its small roses that crawled up a pillar beside the kind Jesus who reached out his hand in blessing. They had arrived at Christina's door. She ushered them inside, pointed to a bench, and ordered the girls to be seated whilst she placed herself behind a table and arranged her gown. Once she was comfortably seated, she looked at them both across the top of a prominently positioned box and a book. Gunhild did not recognize the largish box, but she knew that the book beside it contained the names of postulants and their possessions, those belonging to girls with great fortunes and some without. Eleanor was without, but then she was an accomplished embroideress, and embroidery was of great value. Christina leaned forward and opened the codex, spoiling the perfect arrangement of box and book. Ignoring Gunhild, she glanced up at her friend. Eleanor was a novice. "Yes, I am correct, Eleanor, my dear," she said with a thin smile. "The book indicates that you will take vows next year." "Christina looks like a hawk today." Christina screwed up her eyes and sat back in her chair. "I consider you in need of no further instruction, Eleanor. You may take your vows this Easter." Her thin lips broke into a smile. "Until then, you will work on our tapestry panel for Bayeux. Bishop Odo is anxious this is completed before Pentecost. Canterbury is ahead of us with their panels, and this we cannot allow." Eleanor's shoulders visibly relaxed. Christina turned to Gunhild. Her thin smile became a frown. "Gunhild, we are not considering you as a novice, not just yet, though I expect you to be ready by summer." Christina sat up straight and drew herself taller. "In preparation, you shall attend 4 services daily." Gunhild let a sigh escape her lips. "Not so fast, my girl," Christina continued. She tapped the mysterious box. "You will remove yourself from the scriptorium since you, too, must work on our tapestry panels. The bishop is sending one of his designers to check our work. It has to be perfect. You will be stitching the vow that King Harold took in Bayeux when he acknowledged Duke William as the rightful future King of England." She heard Christina's pronouncement as if it came from a distant world. These were hard words. Her aunt often said that Harold had ignored a promise made on holy relics to be Duke William's man, and that when King Edward had died, her father had bypassed Christina's brother, the atheling Edgar, and had accepted the English throne. Gunhild wanted to cry out, "This is all past, long, long ago. It is nothing to do with me." But she swallowed and bit her bottom lip, the physical pain helping to ease her anger. Christina continued, "As you well know, Gunhild, a vow on holy relics is sacrosanct. Your father's broken promise brought us to war, caused his own death, and has brought God's wrath on us." She lifted her hand and again tapped the box by her elbow. "In this chest are your inks and brushes. They will remain in my possession since there is no need for you to revisit the scriptorium." Gunhild inhaled and silently exhaled. She could feel her heart beating like that of a wounded sparrow she had once held in her hands, trapped within the cage of her fingers. For a moment, she could not breathe. She watched horrified as Christina moved the box to one side, leaned forward and remarked, "By the way, Gunhild, there is a visitor here today, one who wishes to speak with you. I cannot refuse this interview since he is a cousin to King William. So," she leaned back in her chair and sighed, "you may see him in the abbess's antechamber after vespers. Since our beloved abbess is unwell and I am working on the tapestry today, Sister Mart will chaperone you." She waved her hand in a dismissive manner. "Now both of you go about your day." Eleanor bowed her head. "Thank you, Lady Christina," she murmured. Gunhild rose to follow Eleanor but stopped and turned at the door. My visitor's name? Count Alan of Richmond. He knew. Your aunt and says that he has a gift for you, something that belonged to your grandmother, Countess Githa. Now go. I see, Lady Christina. Thank you. Go. I am busy. Gunhild drew another long intake of breath and did not exhale, until she was back in the snowy cloister. Marte led Gunhild to the abbess's receiving chamber and placed her in a chair behind a wooden lattice screen that had been especially imported for the meeting. Marte and Beatrice, both of them lowly nuns, sat behind her with embroidery in their laps. Soon after, Count Alan was ushered in by a servant and shown to a winged chair close to the screen. Since she had seen him last, he had sprouted hair on his chin. His brush of a red beard was nodding this way and that. If she put a finger through the screen's latticework, she could touch that beard. She peeped up and saw, too, how his close-cropped hair gleamed in the candle glow and how his long face was crisscrossed with a light and dark latticed pattern. He leaned in. From behind her chair, Marte clucked her disapproval. Gunhild ignored Marte, and she, too, leaned in towards the screen. His eyes were intense, the color of amber, fox eyes, but it was difficult to tell in sconce light. Perhaps they were just brown, or even tawny. Gunhild, he said in a quiet voice. This time she noticed his pronounced foreign accent. I have come to ask forgiveness for what my people have done to your family. I was responsible for the destruction of Reredfell. I did wrong by your mother. This sin has lain on my conscience for many years. Since the destruction of that estate, we have burned and taken lands from hundreds of those who once farmed them. If the people rebel, they lose everything. These have been cruel years. Take the North, for instance. There was a great rebellion. There 4 years passed, and the lands of Lords Edwin and Morcar, do you remember them, have been laid waste. She nodded. He went on, now sounding impassioned, his voice hoarse with irritation. The punishment was harsh. Laying waste the North is not the way to win the tenants' loyalty. He breathed hard and said, I live in the North, and by Christ one day I shall bring peace to that land. People cannot work the land if they are not at peace, Gunhild. He lowered his voice. And I am Alan now, not Alain. I think it may help me win my tenants' loyalty. I try to be fair, but if they cross me— I see, she interrupted. She had listened to enough of this. Gunhild had not seen the destruction of the North with her own eyes, but she had heard of the rebellion and about King William's revenge. If Count Alan intended to help its recovery, then perhaps not all foreigners were bad. That was if he meant what he said. I hope you will act as you say, she said aloud. Thinking for a moment, she added, You wanted to marry my mother. He steepled his hands. A great wrong was done to her, but no one can turn this tide back from time's shoreline, nor should they. Together, my people and yours will make this land strong again. We will build great abbeys and bring it peace and God's forgiving grace. He opened his hands, palms up. He smiled at her. Gunhild, I have no wife. I am a soldier, and one day I shall need children to inherit my castles. He stopped and looked down at his hands. She waited for him to continue, wondering if he was about to ask for her. He was much older than her. He must be around 35. She felt her eyes widen as a whisper of hope flitted past. Her. He was, after all, a king's cousin. He was studying her face, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. There is no point in asking for you, my lady, because the abbey here does not intend to allow you to leave. Lady Christina says you are about to become a novice, but I believe they have their own motives for holding on to you. Which is? She heard her own voice creak. He lowered his so that the nuns seated behind could not hear. Through you, they can hope for the prosperity that once belonged to your mother. Her estates are legally her lands. Surely the abbey at Canterbury will claim them. I mean, well, since she has become a bride of Christ, surely they must claim what was once her property. she said in an equally low tone. The king, my cousin, will decide their future. Odo of Bayeux and Kent and the Archbishop of Canterbury Lanfranc already have a great fortune. He will not allow more to fall that way. So, well, enough. He shrugged his broad shoulders. What must be, Gunhild. He lifted a purse from his belt, drew open its silk cord, and removed a small object. I hope you accept my concern for your welfare. Confused, she lowered her eyes again. He went on. I came to see you today because I am on my way south to the coast, and I want to give you this. He pushed a golden chain with a jeweled cross attached to it through the latticed grill. As she took the fine chain, their fingers touched, the glittering cross dangling between them. He allowed his fingers to linger. Although only a finger touch, there was strength in it. Behind her, she heard the intake of breath and the clink of a dropped spindle. He withdrew his fingers and said, It belonged to your grandmother. I discovered it when they departed the palace at Exeter. Gunhild started. After the great battle, her grandmother, Countess Geitha, had withdrawn to Exeter with Thea, Gunhild's older sister. Months later, when grandmother had refused to pay King William's tax, the king had marched on Exeter and besieged it in the middle of winter. Countess Geitha had closed the gates on the king and his army, hoping that they could hold out until Gunhild's brothers came from Ireland with an army. After 3 weeks of siege, the burghers of Exeter and their bishop saw the way their future lay and made peace with King William. Aunt Edith had said at the time, Sometimes, my dear Gunhild, it is best to be pragmatic. My mother can be very stubborn. The noblewomen of Exeter had been allowed to go into exile in Flanders and Denmark. That was when her mother, Elditha, had refused to leave England and instead retired to Canterbury. Suddenly, Gunhild realized that Count Alan had stopped speaking and was looking at her curiously. She smiled, and he went on. I kept it safe, thinking one day I might return it. He paused. One day, if you do not take vows, he added quietly, you will be able to wear it outside the cloister. She searched for hopeful meaning in his countenance, but sadly found none. His beard was concealing, his face was neutral. She whispered, I forgive you for Raridfel's destruction, Count Alan. Thank you. It means everything to me. Goodbye, Gunhild. May the Lady Mary protect you. He rose from his chair. There was something she must ask, and she might never have such an opportunity again. She clutched the screen. Wait, Count Alan. Yes, Lady Gunhild? He sat down again. I had a brother called Ulf. He was taken to Normandy. He would be 14 years or so now. Does he live? She felt a moment of hesitation before he said, The youth is well. He dwells in the Norman court with the king's son Robert. That is all I know of Ulf Godwinson. He rose and bowed to her. I hope we have occasion to speak again, my lady. I hope so too, she said quietly, as a sister appeared from the shadows. He turned away, and the nun ushered him out of the chamber. Marte reached for the gift. Gunhild held the cross tightly. No, Sister Marte, this was my late grandmother's crucifix. It is a gift. It belongs to me, not the church. Then, it is kind of the knight to return it. Marta snatched it from Gunhild's fingers and stroked it, saying, Fine gold and little sapphires, much too valuable for a novice. Sister Christina must place it in the treasury. Gunhild had no choice but to hand over the crucifix that linked her to her grandmother, who had lived out her life far away in Denmark and who had died just a year before Aunt Edith. Later, Christina called Gunhild to her chamber and said that when Gunhild had taken her vows, then and only then would her grandmother's crucifix be returned. For days, Gunhild mourned the loss and wept in the solitude of her chamber. She hated Christina more than ever. Every day following a painful period on her knees at sext, nones, vespers, and matins, her anger threatened to rise to the surface. As Gunhild's frustration grew, Eleanor patiently bent a dark head over painstaking embroidery. When Gunhild was in difficulty and about to descend into a tantrum, Eleanor gently reached across to correct her stitches or to guide her hand into the correct position. At the end of a particularly difficult day, Gunhild closed the door to her chamber, edged her key from its hidden place, opened her coffer, and pulled out the green silk overgown. The knowledge that Christina was eating honey cakes in the same private garden where she had once spent treasured hours with Aunt Edith drove her into a fury. As she stood in her chamber with the embroidered silk dress skimming over the paler undergown, soft shoes on her feet and her hair loosened, a momentary wildness possessed her. The dress swirled about her ankles, and as she spun around and around in the Godwin slippers, she felt beautiful. She would have her freedom for one day, her night must come for her. Throughout the hungry Lenten season, Gunhild watched the road. From her open shutters, hoping that the knight would pass this way again and seek her out, but he never came. The only visitor was the tapestry designer from Canterbury, who rode into Wilton on a mule during the 3rd week of February. The designer, a small man with scarred fingers, whose breath stank of garlic and who spoke in a high voice like a boy, singing plain song, stood behind her from terce until sext on the 2nd morning of his visit, watching over her shoulder as her needle plowed slowly back and forwards, embroidering the caskets that allegedly had contained holy relics. He leaned over, touched the fabric, and told her to make sure that Earl Harold's fingers touched both caskets. She looked up with fury in her eyes. "Earl Harold was my father. The promise was a lie," she said quietly. "His fingers never touched those caskets. He never promised to recognize Duke William as King of England after my uncle, King Edward, died." "Insolent girl," the master designer said. "How dare you question?" He called Christina over and, whispering in her ear, drew her away to the far side of one of the charcoal braziers that heated the barn-like room. Christina crossed the flagged floor and yanked Gunhild from her stool. "How dare you say such an untruth?" she hissed through her yellowing teeth. "Those words are treason words. Come with me, my girl." Gunhild spent the rest of that day in her shift on her knees in St. Edith's chapel, shivering, teeth chattering, pretending to pray for forgiveness for her rudeness. That evening, she received a beating from Christina herself, 6 strokes of a willow rod across her bare shoulders. She wore stinging red stripes for days, long after the master designer had departed. It took a whole week for the soothing balm the Abbey's herbalist rubbed into her shoulders each evening and morning to ease the vicious streaks on her white skin. The salve of cowslip and goat's grease could not heal her pride. As the weeks slipped by, her hopes of rescue slowly faded. Eleanor would enter the Benedictine order, and then she would be utterly alone. She thought about escape when she was in the chapel, when mending hose, another task she disliked, and during the tedious silent meals. For a time she squirreled away bread and cheese, thinking that she could walk out into the chill of winter and just leave. But snow lay deep about the Abbey, and the bread went stale. She had to feed it to the birds. If she had taken Aunt Edith's jewels rather than the pearl-trimmed overgown, she could have sold them to a jeweler for silver coin, and used that for a passage to Flanders and freedom, but she had not. Now it was too late. Queen Edith's jewels were locked away in the royal treasury. By March, the weather turned gentler. Postulants were sent into the gardens to plant onions and carrots and to gather herbs to flavor pies and soups. Christina supervised her charges with diligence. "Hurry," she chided. "The abbess says we are to have more visitors. They will expect to see our gardens neat and our workshops as productive as their own. Here, Gunhild, take this basket of greens to the kitchen, and you, Beatrice, take the others to the lane by the weaving shed. There is a great crop of nettles there." Gunhild glowered but held her tongue. Christina wiped soil from her hands and said, "Girls, be in the Abbey church in time for Vespers, clean and neat. No mud on your shoes." Christina shoved the basket into Gunhild's hands and marched off in the direction of the abbess's apartment. On her way to her chamber to change her work overgown, Gunhild caught sight of one of these visitors, a man who looked more like a messenger than a monk. He was of middling stature and dressed in a long, dark blue tunic that was belted at the waist. His hair was cropped short and was graying. He smiled as she passed. She did not hesitate to return the smile, but afterwards she cast her eyes downwards and scuttled off to the novice quarters wondering who he was. He was in the church at vespers with Christina, but he never looked her way. She was just another girl in a brown linen mantle and pale, coarse habit. Closing her eyes, she dreamed of wearing the green gown and of showing the world how she could speak in foreign tongues, and not just write letters, but also cover them with drawings of delicate flowers and tiny animals touched with magical brightness. After vespers, she sat in the silent refectory playing with her spoon. Challenging the rules-imposed silence, the girls had worked out a code of hand signals. When they saw that the nuns were not watching, they moved their hands, gracefully sending messages between each other in a language all of their own. That afternoon, Emma received a message from Greta and passed it on to Beatrice, who passed it to Geetha, who finally nudged Gunhild. Gunhild gasped when she caught its meaning. Greta had traced an M for Marte, 2 circles for her eyes and a rectangle for their building, and sent her fingers walking into every corner of her palm. Marta was searching their chambers. Gunhild dropped her spoon. It clattered on the stone floor and she dived under the table. The nun seated at the lectern glared around the refectory seeking the source of the disturbance. As Gunhild retrieved the spoon, she felt herself flush as scarlet as the blood painted onto the crucified Christ figure that hung from the wall behind the lectern. She scrambled back onto the bench and bowed her head. The nun glared at her and resumed her reading. Eleanor was sitting with the other novices. She glanced over and placed a finger on her lips. The meal stretched out in one long agony. What if Marta demanded the key to her coffer? What if she had actually discovered the key's hiding place? As soon as she could, Gunhild rushed from the refectory to the postulant's building, her heart hammering hard against her ribs. The moment she placed her hand on her own cell door, she sensed that Christina was waiting behind it. She hesitated before pushing the door open. If Christina had discovered the dress, she must confront her and refuse to take novice vows. She opened her door wide. Christina stood in the middle of the chamber, but from a cursory glance, Gunhild could see that nothing had been disturbed. Nothing. "Ah, here you are. Come with me," Christina said, clearly not aware of Gunhild's discomfort. "You have a visitor." Gunhild let out a long, relieved breath. "Count Alan?" "Certainly not." "Compose yourself." Christina snapped and turned about, not even looking anywhere near the locked coffer. "The abbess has news for you." She scowled at Gunhild. "I am not to tell you it. Our Lady Abbess wishes to tell you herself." The nun hurried along through the cloisters like a busy spider, scuttling so quickly that Gunhild could hardly keep pace with her. They passed into the small courtyard and through an archway that led to her aunt's once lovely rooms. She had not entered them since the night she had taken the dress. Now she felt nervous. "Wait here." She stood outside the door, her hands clammy with sweat as Christina knocked on an inner door. A servant opened it and stood aside as they entered. Gunhild modestly glanced down. When no one spoke, she lifted her eyes. The abbess sat very straight in Aunt Edith's chair, smothered in a cumbersome wimple with a heavy shawl-like veil. Even though the evening was warm, she wore a thick mantle, her bony, mottled fingers stretching out from her cloak like little, shrubby branches. The stranger whom Gunhild had met earlier was seated on a cushioned bench by her side. She felt his eyes scrutinize her and dropped her head again. Though she had washed her hands before supper, scrub as she had tried, she simply could not get the garden's green marks off them. She clasped them under the folds of her cloak. "Christina, thank you. You may leave." The abbess dismissed Christina with a little pennant-like wave of her hand. Gunhild watched with surprise as Christina exited the door, her lips pursed. Because she was not asked to stay. The abbess turned to the man seated on the bench. "This is Gunhild, whom your mistress, Matilda of Mortain, sends for, daughter of Harold of Wessex. She is her mother's heiress, so, in time, understand that her lands must come to the abbey at Wilton." Her stare at Gunhild was steely, clearly never kindly, when property was a topic of conversation. Gunhild tried to still her twitching hands. The abbess went on. "We have educated her in languages, in the art of writing and reading, and in English embroidery. Indeed, I must remind you that the child was educated by Queen Edith herself." Gunhild remained very still. The old abbess's clear voice was still strong enough to slice through the soft twilight. "Will she do?" Gunhild started. "Do for what?" The visitor scrutinized her and at last said, "Gunhild, I am Sir Edward of Winchester, steward to Robert of Mortain's wife, Lady Matilda. My Lady of Mortain desires you as a companion for her daughters until they return to Normandy next year." His voice was almost, though not totally, pompous. "Lady Matilda is of English descent and sister to the Earl of Shrewsbury. But as wife to the king's brother, her household is from Normandy, and she wants a native noblewoman to teach her daughters English, as they will spend more time here in England than in Normandy. In a year's space she will deliver you back to Wilton. I understand that you are to take novice vows." Gunhild opened her mouth to reply, but the abbess was already speaking for her. "It is an honor for us." She shifted her weight in her chair and addressed Gunhild. "You depart for Winchester in the morning. Christina will travel with you as far as Romsey Abbey. We have St. Helena's relic to deliver to the Abbey church there before Easter." She lowered her voice into a tone of deep reverence. "The relic belonged to your aunt, Dowager Queen Edith, as you know." She looked at the steward, Edward, as if he did not know. "It is a small fragment of the Holy Cross carried to England centuries past by none other than St. Helena herself. There is no one more suited to carry it there for us than Lady Christina, who is much loved at Romsey." "I see," the steward said. "We can accommodate the relic and Lady Christina under my protection. No doubt there will be a nun from the great Romsey Abbey who can chaperone Gunhild on to Winchester and watch over her until she is settled in Lady Matilda's household." The abbess glanced back at Gunhild. "Yes, a Romsey nun can be trusted to watch over her. She is a sensible girl." She pointed her stubby finger at Gunhild. "You will be ready to make the journey tomorrow, Gunhild. Yes, you should learn much in the household of such as Matilda of Mortain, but do not neglect everything we have taught you here. May St. Edith protect and guide you, my daughter." She raised her hand and made the sign of the cross. Gunhild fell to her knees. "I shall do my best, Lady Abbess." The abbess pulled something from her voluminous mantle and proffered it to Gunhild. "You may wear this as a token of our trust and your status." Gunhild reached for the fine gold chain with the sapphire-studded cross, its small stones glowing in a thin ray of afternoon light that slanted into the chamber. "It is fitting that you wear your grandmother's cross, but do not lose it. Keep it on you always." Without a word, Gunhild slipped the delicate gold chain over her head, allowing it to fall below the neck of her dress where no one could see it. "They have decided for me, but I would never have objected anyway." "Good," the abbess said. "Now go and pack your bag." She called for a waiting nun who ushered Gunhild out of the chamber. Moments later, Gunhild was back in the cloisters where Christina was waiting with a thunderous look on her face. Gunhild knew better than to show her delight to Christina. She wore a serious look to conceal her delight. No one would ever return her to Wilton. This would be her goodbye at last. "You will be glad to return here, Gunhild." Christina loomed over her. "Matilda of Mortain may be English, but I have heard she is a demanding mistress." She prodded Gunhild along the cloisters. "Hurry, we leave at dawn. Bag packed and into the wagon. Father Anthony will drive us. Morton's man will ride ahead of us." When they reached Gunhild's cell in the white building, Christina gave her a push through the open doorway. "No shilly-shallying and no need for goodbyes. You will soon be back here." She took the thin wool of Gunhild's old mantle between her finger and her thumb and pulled her hand back, clearly disgusted. "I shall send you a new one with a fur-trimmed hood, one of my own, and 2 clean gowns, 2 undergowns, and fresh linen from the store chest and a cloth bag to hold them. Leave the old ones here. Be ready to depart after lauds." Gunhild ran through the abbey corridors to the chapel where the nuns were at prayer. In the courtyard, a servant was sweeping the pathways. She could hear sounds from the refectory building, the thumping of platters, tables being laid for supper. From the church plain song floated into the twilight. This was her chance to say goodbye to Eleanor. In a week, her dearest friend would take her vows, and then she would be gone from Gunhild's life forever. Gunhild blended into the shadows of a side chapel. First the nuns filed out, behind them the novices, the postulants, and finally girls. From the school at Wilton, Eleanor walked alone. Gunhild waited until she came close, stepped out and touched her arm. "Did they find anything?" Eleanor spoke, her head bowed as if in prayer. They had practiced the technique for years. Gunhild stepped into place beside her companion and said through lips that were almost closed, "No, but, oh, Eleanor, something good has happened." "What? Do tell." Eleanor's eyebrows arched up into a perfect high curve. "And hurry, I have to attend Christina." As they walked through the fading daylight, Gunhild whispered her fate. Eleanor stopped walking. "And those things, what will you do with them now?" She could almost feel Eleanor's shudder. "If you mean my aunt's dress, it will travel with me. I do not intend to return. I shall discover my new life now." Eleanor looked straight at Gunhild. What foolishness! Then she reached out and clasped her hand. "But may the Queen of Heaven protect you." "I shall never forget you, my Eleanor." She squeezed Eleanor's hand. "The abbess has returned my gold chain," she added. Eleanor squeezed her hand back. "Good." Gunhild saw sorrow in her gray eyes. "If you do not come back to us, then I shall pray for you every day of my life," Eleanor said. "And I for you, Eleanor, though perhaps we are not entirely lost to each other." She lifted the cross from her neck, placed it to her lips, and kissed it. "My grandmother was patron of St. Oswith's Priory near Exeter. My mother was patron of St. Benet's in Suffolk. I shall be patron of an abbey one day also." She tucked her cross safely back into her gown. They had reached the fork in the trackway. Eleanor gestured towards the nuns' hall. "If God wills it, it will be so." She lifted Gunhild's hand to her lips. "I have to go now. Christina will be waiting for me. Remember, I shall have you in my prayers, always." Her joy saddened by loss, Gunhild watched for a moment as Eleanor's thin, gray-cloaked figure followed the pathway to Christina's chamber. How could she bear this loss? Yet she must think of the future and pray that one day they would meet again. Choking back tears, she hurried in the opposite direction back to her cell to throw her scant belongings into the linen sack. As she lifted the silk dress from her coffer, she felt a tear escape and trickle down her cheek. She wiped it away and tried instead to be practical. How could she bring Aunt Edith's dress? There was only one possible way. She must wear it. Chapter 4, March 1076. You loved Count Alan Rufus, and he loved you. Archbishop Anselm, 1093, to Gunhild, quoted from King Harold's Daughter by Richard Sharp in Haskin's Journal, Volume 19. Father Anthony, one of Wilton's 5 priests, lifted the cart horse's reins into his aged hands while Edward of Winchester climbed onto a brown gelding. This was no tall and powerful knight encased in armor like Alan of Richmond, Gunhild noted, as he took up his position to ride in front of the wagon. The aging steward wore a simple brown tunic and a fine woolen mantle with a hood that lay across his shoulders. For protection, a dagger was tucked into his belt, and a valuable jewel-encrusted scabbard that contained a knight's sword hung from it. Did he not worry that it might be stolen from him? She felt for the sayax Christina had given her, saying as she handed it over to Gunhild, "The woods are full of dangers. Use the knife if your maidenhead is under threat. Remember, it belongs to God alone." Gunhild took up her place on the faded cushioned seat opposite Christina. As she eased onto the stained side bench, she spread her clothing with care, making sure that her mantle covered her new gray overgown and the silk dress that she wore beneath it. She had concealed the Godwin shoes and the gold-embroidered fillet amongst undergarments in the linen sack that lay by her feet. Followed by her servant who carried her sheepskin traveling bag, Christina climbed in and sat on the bench opposite. She wedged a box between her and the elderly servant. With a flick of Brother Antony's whip, the wagon rolled forward, and they were off. As they exited the abbey gate and rattled along the track towards the woods that took them in the direction of Romsey, Christina kept a bony hand on the reliquary as if it were likely to fly off at every jolt that rocked their litter. They traveled for miles in this way, without conversing, and with Christina's hand hovering over a fragment of the true cross, her lips moving in silent prayer. Gunhild tried to peep out of the covers to see what lay in the world beyond the abbey. Laborers had not yet come out into the fields, and the land was still. Mist hung in the air, shrouding the countryside and hushing everything except the sighs of their breathing, the clippity-clop of the horse, and the rolling of wagon wheels. It was so eerie that Gunhild wondered whether ghosts would slip out of the hedgerows. But nothing sinister crossed their pathway, and the wagon rattled on along lanes overhung with hedges of white hawthorn until, at length, they dropped down into deep woods from where they would take the old routeway towards Romsey Abbey. Christina's hand fell away from the relic as the wagon's steady rhythm lulled her into a doze. When they trundled into sunken lanes filled with new growth, Gunhild listened to the sound of cuckoos, blackbirds, and the woodland scuffles of small creatures in the verges. Eventually, the servant's eyes also closed. Gunhild sat up, alert, excited and silent, imagining what new experiences she might discover in Winchester. Would Matilda of Mortain take her to court in London? Could she ask for new brushes and inks, or would she be forced to embroider day after day in the Bower Hall, just as she had to lately at Wilton? Was she to be ordered about as she had been at Wilton? Or would those who had care of her in Winchester treat her as the princess she truly was? She tilted her head up. She would behave as a princess. No one would treat her otherwise, now that she had escaped the confines of the abbey. She reached up and touched her grandmother's cross, where it lay about her neck, for comfort. "Yes, grandmother, you had pride, and it was no sin," she whispered to herself. Trees rustled in the light spring breeze, and birds sang amongst branches that stretched tall in a woven canopy above the wagon. She watched the sun glinting through beech trees that opened in endless long marches before them. For a time they met no other travelers until around midday. When the sun rode high above the trees, she heard voices edging closer towards their wagon. Wood pigeons rose up high into the trees, rattling branches and squawking down. A pheasant screeched. There came a great swishing of foliage close by, followed by human shouts, horse neighs, and clanking armor. She lifted the wagon's curtain to peer out. As she did, horses clattered past them, shaking the litter's frame. She felt a great shuddering sensation and reached out for the side of the litter, clutching at the curtain, nearly pulling it. Down! Christina's eyes snapped open. The hitherto silent servant shrieked, "Saint Edith, save us!" Father Antony yelled, "Christ's sainted bones!" The precious relic box dropped onto the wagon's floor with a great thump. Gunhild's linen bundle tumbled forward as the wagon dropped down on its side with a jolt. Out! Father Antony's voice reached through the curtains of the litter. There is a devil's curse on this useless wagon. We need to fix a wheel, and it can't be done with your weight inside. By now, men were shouting and horses were stamping around them. Gunhild leaned forward and grabbed the opposite wall of the unbalanced wagon with both her hands. She peered out. The beech trees had slid to a tilt. They were collapsed against a bank of nettles. Christina roughly pushed her aside. "You stupid girl, get out! We have lost a wheel." Christina and her servant were too distracted by the stinging nettles to notice the drop of silk as Gunhild lifted her skirts to climb out. With the forest floor safely beneath her stout shoes, Gunhild tugged at her dress, trying to pull it over her silken gown. Freed from the wagon and the bank, she followed Christina around the litter to the back. Behind the tumbled litter, a band of soldiers wearing glittering mail were climbing off their horses. Father Antony was kneeling by a dislodged wheel. Edward, the steward, was down from his mount and was ruminating with a tall knight. As Christina advanced, the priest's head jerked up from behind the wheel like a puppet's at a fair. "I was only trying to allow the soldiers passage." He struggled to his feet, clearly meaning to face up to Christina's wrath. Turning from the steward, the knight spoke calmly to Christina. "The priest steered your wagon's horse too far into the deep bank of the track. He was allowing us passage, but the outer back wheel came away from the bed of the wagon. You should have given way to us, or come past us one by one, not in a crashing huddle," she snapped, glaring at the knight, her eyes widening with recognition. Gunhild, too, at that moment saw who he was and found herself smiling at him. Edward of Winchester lifted his hands and said, "Lady Christina, peace, peace, please, please, kind lady." His voice rising each time he spoke the word. "No harm done. This is the king's cousin, Count Alan of Richmond. He offers to help get us back on the road. I know very well who he is. No introduction is necessary." "Ah, Christina of Wilton, greetings." Count Alan bowed low and smiled beguilingly at Christina. Gunhild was sure Christina's frost must melt and glanced happily at him. She could not believe her good fortune as Count Alan turned to her. In that moment, all she could see was his even features and his eyes that had been amber in candlelight, glowing as brown as treacle, and his red beard glinting like a woodland fox's bristly tail in the sunlight that fell through gaps in the eye canopy. This meeting surely promised her a future. She sent a silent prayer to her name-day saint, Saint Bridget. "Let him ask at Winchester for me." Count Alan bowed to her. "And so we meet again, my Lady Gunhild, daughter of Harold. Edward tells me you are traveling to Romsey Abbey." Christina spoke before Gunhild could reply. "She is to join the household of Robert of Mortain. We are delivering a gift for the abbey at Romsey. After that, Gunhild must continue to Winchester, so if you can help us get this wagon back on the road, we can be on our way." She shook her cloak impatiently and looked about her with a sharp shudder. By evening there will be wolves in these woods, and heaven only knows what other dangers. "Is that so, my lady? Then we must give you our protection. Nightfall in the king's forest can indeed catch travelers unawares." Steadying his prancing stallion, Count Alan called over to two of his soldiers and spoke with the men. They immediately tethered the horses to a tree and began to work on the wagon's wheel. Father Antony grunted his thanks, wiped his hands on his robe, and sank down onto the verge to watch. When the wheel was securely in place, Count Alan said to Christina, "Now, Lady Christina, accept us as an escort. We, too, are set for Romsey tonight." The nun drew herself up in an imposing manner. Gunhild could not help but admire Christina's sense of dignity as she said, "Well, Count Alan, I shall accept, but I insist that you ride 2 wagon lengths behind us, and Sir Edward must ride before us. Remember, I am a bride of Christ, and she is—" Christina paused and waved her hand towards Gunhild. "Make no mistake about it, destined to become Christ's bride." Count Alan inclined his head. "As you wish, but should we not ride before you to proclaim your arrival?" "My Lady Christina?" Christina snorted. She surveyed the wagon, which was now upright and with all its wheels firmly on the road again. "I would prefer you kept your distance, my lord. Behind is best." She gathered up her cloak and, straight-backed, helped by her silent servant, she clambered back into the litter. Gunhild started. Count Alan was staring at her. Well, not exactly at her, but down at her feet. She followed his gaze. An inch of green silk hemmed with flowers and pearls had dropped below her mantle. She tugged her plain dress over it and, gathering her cloak close, looked boldly at him. There was a little smile about his mouth. His beard twitched. He said in a whisper so quiet that only she caught his words, "Pearls for a virgin." With a flurry of her mantle, she turned and climbed back into the wagon after Christina's servant. Christina arranged herself on her cushioned seat once again. She rescued the reliquary from the floor and placed it with care between her and her maid-servant. She said, "We shall reach Romsey in time for Vespers. Only after we see this," she pointed to the relic, "safe in the Abbey church do we eat." Gunhild nodded obediently, though her stomach grumbled. She had eaten nothing since they had left Wilton hours before. As Christina and her servant once again dozed, Gunhild peeped out through the curtain at the back of the wagon, watching Count Alan ride on his stallion, his large troop behind him, and his elegant pennant, checkered gold and azure, carried by his squire before him, fluttering whenever a breeze snatched at it. As Christina had predicted, they rattled into the Abbey yard shortly before Vespers. The distance between Count Alan and his troop and their litter had gradually narrowed on the approach, so that both parties arrived at Romsey simultaneously. Priests and nuns poured out from the main building to greet them. The abbess, a portly woman, stepped from the crowd of sisters and stood in the yard waiting for them to descend from their litter. One by one, they climbed out. Abbess Hilda at once clasped Christina's hands in delight and fussed around like a clucking pigeon, as if Christina was not a drab princess from an old forgotten royal family, but a queen. Christina could claim descent from King Alfred himself, and naturally the English clergy would bow and scrape to her. She was old royalty, and even now she was connected to the Scottish royal family through her sister's marriage to King Malcolm. Her brother Edgar, the Atheling, was currently at peace with King William and often at court, a fact that Christina had liked to crow about when they had been stitching that dreadful tapestry for Bayeux. Christina wasted no time in proffering her gift, and as they walked towards the Abbey's hall, she explained the purpose of her visit. Abbess Hilda took charge of the precious relic as soon as they were inside. Her white tapered fingers held the crystal reliquary with great care and reverence. She turned it round and round, examining and exclaiming at the beautiful jeweled reliquary, inside which the fragment of the cross was enfolded in purple velvet cloth. How many such fragments? Were there in abbeys, minsters, and shrines all over Europe? That reliquary must have cost my Aunt Edith a great fortune. Gunhild, bored with the fuss over the crystal-encased gift, turned her attention from Christina to Count Alan, who had followed them inside. His expressionless face gave nothing away. He watched, unsmiling and not speaking. Gunhild realized, with a jolt, that he was not really looking at the reliquary at all, but beyond it, surreptitiously watching her, glancing away when she noticed. The abbess handed the relic to her priest, turned to Count Alan, and said, "We are busy here and have little enough room for guests. Pilgrims are arriving for our Easter feast, but Sir Edward and the priest can have space in our priest's house, and we can provide you and your men with shelter in our guest hall." He thanked her and smiled at Gunhild as, looking with humility at Christina, the abbess purred, "And you must, of course, have the only available chamber inside my own dwelling. There will be a pallet for your servant." For a moment, a smile played on her mouth. "I can give Gunhild a cot in the infirmary. The chamber is private with a view over our herb gardens, and since there are nuns' cells all around her, she will feel safe." It belongs to our infirmary sister who is visiting the sick of Michaelmarsh and won't return before tomorrow." "I am sure the girl is grateful," Christina said. Gunhild cast her eyes downwards. "I am grateful, Lady Abbess," she said humbly. She would not have to share a narrow bed with Christina. She raised her eyes again. The Count was stretching his hands towards the blaze in the central hearth, and was watching her again with bemusement in his eyes. She glanced down again, but from the edges of her sight noticed how easily he shifted his attention, thanked the abbess, and with a sweep of his mantle, bowed and departed. The abbey servants carried Gunhild's linen bag into the infirmary. She followed them and sank exhausted onto the cot. Minutes later, she heard the bells ringing for vespers. Shaking off her aching tiredness, she hurried back into the yard. When she arrived in the abbey church, Christina was already kneeling beside Abbess Hilda near the altar. A choir stood as if to attention in the choir stalls, and the abbey's priest began intoning prayers over the crystal reliquary. The abbey church was packed with monastery guests, a collection of merchants, pilgrims most likely on their way to Southampton to set sail for Compostela, and, finally, Gunhild observed ahead of her, halfway to the altar, Count Alan kneeling beside 6 of his companions, with bared heads bowed and their armor gleaming in the candlelight. Gunhild moved up the nave past them, but could not resist glancing at his shining head as she passed. He looked up and pointed down. Her embroidered hem had once again crept below her plain overgown. She adjusted her mantle and boldly looked back. He ignored this and brought his hands together in prayer. After the Mass, as she followed Christina out of the nave, Count Alan reached out as she passed, touching her arm. "Wait," he said so low she could hardly hear his words. She paused and bent down to adjust her mantle. "Can you slip away from her?" he said. "I wish to speak with you." "After supper. I can excuse myself, maybe." "Yes, do that. Go to the privies during the meal. They lie behind the hall." It was a momentary exchange, but Gunhild's heart lifted with excitement. They filed from the church into the refectory, and all the time she looked ahead as if nothing had happened. Christina was talking to Abbess Hilda, and her servant was absent, probably preparing Christina's chamber for the night. Gunhild hurried forward past Christina, losing herself amongst the other nuns. Inside the long refectory hall, tables were laid with white napery and wooden platters, cups and spoons. All was hushed except for the rattle as servants set jugs of water and panniers of bread on the snowy cloth. Talk was forbidden here, as at Wilton, so she silently slipped into a position of her own choosing before Christina caught her up and bade her sit beside her and the abbess. She found she had seated herself amongst a group of nuns directly across from Count Alan, his 6 knights, and the pilgrims. She was thankful when Christina sat by the abbess, flanked on both sides by dark-gowned priests. There was no room there for Gunhild. After a long grace was intoned from the corner lectern, Gunhild broke her hunk of bread and ate ravenously, mopping the juices from her bowl of pottage as if she had not seen food for a week. It still being Lent, dishes of baked eggs, custards, and plates of cheese arrived in succession onto the table. She thankfully ate all placed before her. Gunhild's sense of anticipation mounted as the meal progressed. What had he to say to her that was so urgent and secret? From time to time her hand flew to the golden chain and the jeweled cross that Count Alan had brought to her months earlier. Her hands twitched nervously, and her spoon seemed to make an exaggerated scrape. The suspense was excruciating, and the wait terrible, especially as he never looked her way, but ate in the required silence slowly and deliberately, not dropping a crumb on the cloth. Glancing towards Christina, she saw the nun's head was bowed as if in prayer. Gunhild turned to the nun by her side and whispered her need to go to the privy. The nun never spoke, but pointed to a side door halfway along the refectory wall. Gunhild climbed over the bench, slipped out of the door, and without once looking back, passed safely through the refectory's back porch into a muddy yard behind. She hurried towards a row of wattle and daub huts that had been erected over a running stream. There was usually a stink about such places, but these were obviously kept clean since the usual evil smell was absent. She hovered amongst a clump of withies by the stream, hoping he would come soon and find her. Christina might note her absence and send someone to look for her. Moments later she heard strong footsteps tramping over the cobbles by the refectory wall. Holding her breath, she retreated into the shelter of an elm tree. She recognized his russet mantle as he made his approach. She breathed freely again and stepped out onto the path. Moments later, he was by her side. He lifted her hand to his lips, and she felt a new sensation shiver through her as his touch lingered on her hand. He spoke softly. "My lady, there is little time, so I must be brief." Her eyes widened as he said, "It is clear to me that your vocation is not strong." He paused. She suddenly felt overcome with modesty. He continued, "But I can save you from the cloister." "My lord." "Count, I am to be taken into the household of Matilda of Mortain, though perhaps she will be kind and help me. What do you think, my lord?" "It is all a plot. I think that Robert of Mortain will have plans for a Godwin heiress, and if you do not agree to his schemes, you will be swiftly returned to the Abbey cloister." "What might be Lord Robert's plans for my future?" "He will give you to one of his sons as a husband, and if you refuse, you will indeed find yourself returned to Wilton, where you will take vows and live your life out behind convent walls. Clearly that fate is not one you desire?" "Perhaps I might agree. Perhaps, my lord, I would welcome marriage with a great-nephew of King William." He took her hand, bent down and kissed it. "Would you? He has a mean reputation." Held her hands, enclosing them with his. A strange sensation. Indeed, but though she felt she ought, she could not pull away. She caught her breath and swallowed. She breathed again, slowly. He continued, "Would you find me acceptable, my lady, because I can save you from either fate? There are many who will take what they can always, but a good man would marry you. For love." His words sounded truthful. Momentarily her mother's image flitted past her eyes. He would have married her and not for love. She glanced up into his eyes. They contained an aloof look, not reflecting the love of which he spoke. They lacked passion, yet love her he must. He had to, if he said a good man would marry her for love, and she was longing for love. So in that moment, she decided that he did, and sealed her fate. She gathered her courage and matched his cool look with a bold one of her own. "What are you suggesting, Count Allen? Is it that I marry you?" "Yes, my dear lady, and I would willingly come to Wilton Abbey seeking your hand, but you know that the nuns will not agree. Nonetheless, our marriage can be arranged." He let go of her hands. "Before morning we can be on board my vessel at Southampton, and by mid-morning we can be far away from here, sailing across the narrow sea. I am set for Brittany on the king's business. If we are married by a priest in God's house, it does not matter if Christina objects. She cannot undo it." He reached down and plucked up the hem of her dowdy gown. Below it, a hem of gold embroidery and seed pearls glowed in the moonlight. He pulled her plain gown over the hem of her silk dress and let her mantle fall back over it. His face lines creased with laughter. "This tells me much about you, though I am puzzled by its provenance. It belonged to my aunt. Now it belongs to me." He moved so close to her again that she could feel his breath on her cheek and his touch on her arm. He was the answer to her prayers. She would disappoint so many. And could she trust the man who had only 8 years ago pursued her mother? Still, it only took her a heartbeat to whisper, "How can we marry, my lord?" "You agree?" She nodded. "I do." "Come to the Abbey's chapel. I know Romsey Abbey well. There is a latch gate in the garden wall behind the infirmary. Follow the pathway through the pear trees behind the Abbey buildings until you are by the chapel. Another gate will lead you to a side porch. The door will be ajar. After the midnight bell rings, I shall be there, waiting for you inside." There was a rattle close by. Breaking off, he glanced about. She followed his eyes. It was only a blackbird rustling through a clump of withies. He turned back to her. "There is a priest here who is from Brittany. He will do as I tell him. I shall bring witnesses. Do you pledge me your troth, Gunhild?" He lifted her fingers and kissed them one by one, and as he did, she whispered, "I do, my lord. It is what I want." He clasped her hands and said, "I too. I pledge my troth to you." He took her face in his hands and kissed her lightly on her lips. "Return to the table and act as if nothing is amiss. I must see to my horses." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Gunhild, you will not regret this." As if an invisible thread had broken, leaving no trace, Count Alan had gone. It was as if he had never been with her, except that he had left on her lips the imprint of a kiss, and in her heart, hope for a new life. For a candle flame's flicker, she felt the enormity of what she was about to do. She could still go to Christina and confess her sin, but as she slid back onto the bench to sit beside the dark, brooding nuns of Ramsey, she dismissed any sense of regret. Gunhild lay wakeful under a coarse blanket on her lumpy cot. She had put aside her plain gown and unbound her hair. When the bell rang, she found herself moving and dressing as if walking through sleep. She wore her aunt's undergown and rich overgown. With haste, she stuffed her ordinary garb into her sack. Pulling on her cloak and clutching her linen bag, she slipped out of the infirmary into the herb garden. She picked her way through pear trees that lined the garden wall until she discovered the latch gate which led to a path behind the abbey buildings. Moments later, she was passing the guest house where Count Alan's soldiers slept. She paused, glanced up at the curved sliver of a moon, and stopped, starting at an unexpected sound and nearly dropping her bundle. It was only an owl's hoot. She caught a breath of chill night air and steeled herself. Hurrying on, thankfully she reached the church without meeting anyone. When she pushed the side door open, she found herself again in the narrow nave. Yifuntor. Alan was kneeling by the altar where earlier the relic had sat, now gone. The priest must have locked it away. She tiptoed to the rail and knelt down beside him. His armor glinted below his russet cloak. Bare-headed in the candlelight, he looked noble and honorable. He reached out for her hand. "My lady, I thought you might not come." "I am ready," she whispered. "There is little time. We must go into the porch." She turned her head towards him. He was smiling at her. He had called her "my lady" again. No one ever called her "my lady" except Count Alan. It had always been simple Gunhild, or the girl, or Swan-Daughter. This man, who had once wanted to wed with her mother, and who was 15 years her senior, surely had gentleness in his heart. Count Alan took a deep breath and looked down at Gunhild. He stared at the gap caused by the falling back of her mantle and smiled. "Christ's holy bones, that dress is indeed suitable for a princess to wed in." Gunhild stood, letting her mantle hood fall back. Her hair was loose and it cascaded around her shoulders, rippling into a golden fall of waves. "I am ready, my lord," he called out. "Father Adolphus, we are waiting." An aged priest appeared from a curtained enclosure beyond the altar and was followed by a small woman in a dark cloak and a man clad in armor. The priest led them into the alcove by the porch. It opened into a small side chapel to Our Lady. Alan made the introductions in a low voice. "Gunhild, Father Adolphus, and Hubert of Ridgely. Hubert is the commander of my troop. The lady is Hubert's woman, Anne." He nodded at the priest and said in a firm tone, "Father, there is no time to spare." The ceremony was brief. They plighted their troth, and Alan placed a narrow silver ring from his smallest finger onto the third finger of her right hand. To Gunhild, it was exquisite. As she looked closely, she saw that it was engraved with tiny, curling flowers. Anne produced pale linen ribbons and tied her hands to Alan's. The priest gave them his blessing, and it was done. Alan of Richmond was her husband, handfasted to her as her mother had once been handfasted to her father. However, it was different because she was also wed in a church porch by a priest of the church, and no one could change what had passed. Count Alan towered over her. "Draw up your hood. Your hair and gown would attract a praying monk. Keep your mantle close," he warned. "Listen carefully to what I say to you." As the priest merged into the church's shadows, Alan took her arm and walked with her back through the nave to a side door. "Wait with Anne and Hubert for me behind the church. My men must get out of the guest house and into the stable before that fool Edward of Winchester wakes up, comes prowling and puts 2 and 3 together. With luck and stealth we can be on. The road south well before matins. With fortune on our side we can be on my ship before anyone misses you." He kissed her on both cheeks. "God forgive me for this." He traced his finger along her face. "You are a beauty and a trusting beauty. When we are in Brittany, I shall write to the king. He owes me much, including peace in his northern kingdom. But let us pray that his half-brother does not object and attacks my castles, not forgetting that the Lady Christina wants your inheritance for Wilton." Lowering his voice further, he said, "You are wise to trust in my protection. Gunhild." He removed the linen bands from her hands, where they still dangled loosely, and handed them back to Anne. "Now wait." With a sweep of his mantle, he hurried back around the church towards the guest house, leaving Hubert to watch at the gable corner. Anne watched from the further end of the church. Gunhild was alone again. Folding her cloak about her, she leaned into the wall, glad the moon was not bright. If she kept very still, nothing could find her. She remembered that when she was a little girl, her father had told her about Brittany's castles, about marshlands, and a great abbey on a rock dedicated to St. Michael. He had recounted tales about dragons and magical creatures that lived by the shore and sirens that lured sailors. She prayed silently to St. Bridget that she would soon see those shores. Footsteps. Approached, a cloud crossed the moon and Hubert disappeared. The cloud passed, the sliver of moon glowed again, the stars shed light over the brooding trees beyond her stony refuge, and he returned. "My Lady Gunhild, come, our horses are in the lane." Anne hurried from her post by the bell tower, took Gunhild's arm and guided her behind the building. Once they were amongst trees, someone reached out for her. Alan had come to meet them. She allowed him to hold her close and lead her past a stand of dark elms, along a track, and through a large gap in the hedgerow into a meadow where a score of shadowy men and horses waited. Alan took his horse from a soldier and gently pulled the stallion forward by its reins. "Can you ride pillion behind me?" "Yes, though I have not ridden in years." "Hubert, lift her up into the saddle." Moments later she was clinging. To Count Alan's sides, her gown bunched up about her thighs, heels close into the stallion's withers, and they were cantering along trackways southwards over the downs. Gunhild experienced sublime exhilaration as they flew south, as if ancient dragons had awakened and were in pursuit. She was not a postulant now, not even a companion to Matilda of Mortaine's daughters. She was the wife of Count Alan of Richmond and Penthièvre. Chapter 5. Then a sail, a great sea garment, was fastened with guys to the mast. Beowulf. A verse translation by Kevin Crossley Holland, 1968. Shortly before dawn, they rode off the hills to the shores of the river Itchen, where an assortment of small craft was waiting for them by a jetty. Hubert helped Gunhild to drop from the stallion. She struggled to her feet, stiff and exhausted. Count Alan threw his leg over and slid down with ease. He lifted her into his arms and carried her onto a waiting skiff where he sat her down beside. Anne, Hubert's woman. The small boats would take them out into the deeper water of the Sound where Alan said his ship was anchored. "We'll have a northwesterly, so we are fortunate," she overheard Count Alan say to Hubert when he climbed back onto the landing stage and called for 2 of his men to come and row them out to his ship. He leaned down from the jetty to Gunhild and touched her shoulder. "My love, May I call you that?" He paused as she nodded. There was merriment in his countenance as, rocking the craft, he clambered back in and on to the side bench, abruptly gesturing to Hubert to sit opposite. Him, "Well, my love, you will soon see the ship." His voice sounded animated. To match his enthusiasm, her feeling of excitement increased. When he added, "And when we reach my homeland, you will have your own castle," she thought she would swoon with delight. He was her prince. It was a fairy tale coming true. Their 2 soldiers rowed them along the River Itchen and into Southampton's Sound. The others followed in a small fleet of rowing vessels. Alan pointed out his ship to Gunhild, saying his was called the Mermaid. It was taller and bigger than the others that seemed to crowd about it like miniature painted beasts. As dawn broke over the Sound, Gunhild saw that the ships rocking on the sea all possessed brightly decorated sails and carved animal heads at their prows. So many vessels were gathered there that it was difficult to know how they could possibly navigate their skiffs through them. Yet she watched, thrilled, as Count Alan's men wove their tiny rowing boats effortlessly around lesser ships, all smaller and squatter than the Mermaid, until, at last, they reached it. "Can you climb, or shall I hoist you up in a net as we—" "Would a sea creature," Count Alan said to her. In front of them all, he chucked her under her chin, as a parent would a child. She was embarrassed by this overly familiar gesture in front of his men. They had known each other for less time than it takes for an hour candle to burn from top to stump. "I am perfectly able to climb," she responded, and considered the knotted rope ladder. "Then up you go." There was a twinkle in his eyes as he added, "If Christina and her pack of hounds, including that low creature Edward of Winchester, are not to catch us, you had best make it quick." She looked up again at the dangling rope and remembered how she and Ulf had climbed trees years before at her father's estate of Notzing. As she stood up in the rocking skiff to seize the rope, she felt Alan's hands on her waist. Before she could protest, he had lifted her up, and she did what came naturally to her. She grasped the rope ladder tight with both hands. "Climb carefully, my lady. I am behind to catch you." He reached up and pushed her gently from behind, and she began to move. Though this ascent was undignified, she could not complain of his hand on her backside or the way he guided her legs. It felt firm and secure. A shiver ran through her as his hand momentarily crumpled up her gown and, creeping up, touched the naked part of her above the ties that held her leggings closed. If she had not been so terrified of falling or others noticing, though he was so close behind her, he was completely shielding her back, she would have quite enjoyed the physicality of his hands on her thighs. She must hold on and move her hands upwards, one after the other. Remember the tree climbing. No hesitation. She must not look down. She could not look up. Her dress fell back again. He allowed her to climb on ahead. She concentrated on her arms, moving her hands up the knots one after another, catching the shaky rope cradles with her feet until a sailor leaned over the side of the vessel, grasped her wrists, and hauled her on board. Moments later, Alan was up behind her. He placed an arm about her shoulder to steady her on the rocking deck, held her close, and turned her around to look back to shore. "Look how small the land seems now. Once we are all of us on board, we can catch the wind." He touched her face. "Don't look so scared. I thought you wanted this." She nodded and said earnestly, "Oh, yes, I do." She did want this. She had won her night, and nothing could change it. She felt his strength as he squeezed her arm and was pleased when he said, "Then, no return, my love. Let us get you comfortable." Before she could reply, he turned her round again and pointed to a wooden shelter in the poop end of the ship. "That will be your bower. Later Anne will serve you, but for now you should try to sleep whilst the water is calm." "In a while," she said, her voice high with the thrill of being on such a magnificent vessel. I want to wait until everyone else is on board. I want to see everything. I was a child the last time I was on a ship, you know, and that was only my father's dragon ship that sailed on the River Thames when my Uncle Edward was king." He looked down at her, his mouth curving into a smile. For a moment he hesitated, then said, "As you wish, Gunhild, but once everyone is on board, I must make sure the men are ready to hoist the sails. This is a cargo vessel, a sailing ship. We only use oars in narrow channels, sometimes in maneuvers, such we must now make, to get us out into the narrow sea. Look at the oar holes." He pointed to either side, to the fore and aft, where there were oar ports and benches. He then waved to the mid-deck area, where there was a gaping hole. "And below us, there is a great hold for cargo." Gunhild looked to where Alan had indicated the oar ports, situated to either side of where they were standing, and then to where a ladder went down through the great hole into the heart of the vessel. While they were talking, his men were boarding, clambering up the rope and over the side in the same way as she had. The cacophony of sound would have terrified her had she not been so thrilled by all the movement around her and the knowledge that at last she was free of Christina and Wilton. There was shouting, clamoring, clanking, a screeching of seagulls, creaking of ropes, unfamiliar accents, noise, so much of it. By now, many of Alan's men were stowing their gear and bundles in the hold amidship behind them. He put a hand on her arm and called over to the last of his soldiers as they climbed. Over the ship's high walls, he picked out 2 of them to take up spare places on the oar benches to the fore and aft. He tested the ropes that secured the great sail. When the men were all on board, he left her. Calling for Hubert to accompany him, he made his way to the ship's prow to speak to his sea captain. She wondered where Anne was. Looking around, she saw the woman lift up the leather curtain that protected the poop-end wooden shelter and come onto the deck. Mantle flapping, Anne crossed to a great sea chest. She opened it with the help of a seaman and seemed to be inspecting its collection of cooking gear, lifting up a skillet and a few bowls. Replacing these, she took out 2 wooden cups, nodded to the seaman, and vanished back through the curtain. Again. Gunhild turned her attention to Alan, who, along with Hubert and the captain, was watching the fleet of empty boats being rowed back to land by men who were not to accompany them. Her excitement was mounting again because now she knew they were about to sail. At last he returned to his place beside her. The sea captain called, "En avant, allez maintenant!" As the oarsmen began rowing in a rhythm, the ship slowly moved. Forward. She stumbled, and he caught her. "The shelter," he said. "Hold on to me. If it stays calm, you can come out later and see for yourself how wonderful it is to be on the sea. The stars at night are magical to behold. Can you swim?" She felt an invisible chill wrap her round. She could swim if only she could remember how. She had learned to swim as a child. From the depths of her memory, she pulled out a picture of her older brothers, her sister Thea, and her tiny brother Ulf. Her mother was laughing as she and her maids helped them into the river and taught them to kick and move their arms. She had taught them to stay afloat and swim like a row of moorhens plowing the stream. "I can swim perfectly well, but surely it will not be necessary." She felt a frown crease her forehead. "No, indeed." He held open the leather curtain to reveal that the shelter was in fact a room with a sleeping couch that was piled high with sheepskins and cushions. There was a table fastened to iron deck rings by leather straps and 3 folding stools secured to the floor planks, as if they grew out of them. A hook on the wall held a heavy, hooded cape of hard material. She reached out to touch it. "It is oiled linen, hardened to withstand the worst of the weather. Use it if it gets stormy. It will take us a day to reach the ports on the Cotentin. After that, we ride south to Brittany, rest and sleep. There has been none of that these last 12 hours." The boat lurched and she fell against him. She trembled at the contact. He held her close to him. "You are so lovely." Drawing her even closer, so close she felt crushed by him, the sensation delicious, he said into her hair, Gunhild, we can make this real now. My men do not need me. No one will disturb us. He let the leather curtain fall behind them and took her in his arms. As she flowed into his embrace, her hair fell around her face and tumbled about her mantle. When he said, "How beautiful," she felt that she was wanted. When he placed a finger under her chin, the I-do gesture felt intimate, and she lifted her face towards his. She was tall, almost as tall as him, so when his mouth claimed hers it was as equals, his face against hers, his lashes flickering close to hers, and his body folding around hers. Moments later her cloak slid to the planks by her feet, and he was expertly unlacing her gown. It shivered from her into a soft silken pile on the floor. "Mermaid," he whispered. She whispered back, "What if anyone hears? I cannot bear for anyone to know." "Hush, no one will dare come near us. Do not fear. We are wedded, and this is what married people do. They are all busy about their own tasks. My men will stay away. Anne is out on the deck helping the cook. If we had a wedding feast afterwards, everyone would crowd into our chamber to see us bedded." "Yes, that is true." She opened her eyes wide and glanced down, almost surprised that she was standing in her linen undergown. No man had ever seen her so disrobed, and few women. He lifted her onto the couch. He knelt by her feet and removed her boots, her leg bindings, then his own boots and leggings. "Help me from my tunic," he said, as he unpinned his cloak and allowed it to drop from his shoulders. Timidly, she unlaced his tunic and helped him to pull it off. He kissed her fear away, her face and her lips as he laid her out on the bed. She had never seen a naked man before, not in real life. There were tapestry pictures and religious paintings in books depicting a nearly naked Christ on the cross, Jonah in a whale, Saint Sebastian's martyrdom, but she had never seen a real naked man. She opened her eyes wide, tossed her heavy hair away, and boldly stared at his risen manhood. What was this? Was this how men penetrated women? Was it the evil some nuns spoke of in hushed tones, saying, "It is a married woman's duty to make children"? They had shaken their heads, not thinking she was listening from her place, weeding the marigold beds in the garden. What a shame that Queen Edith failed in her duty. If she had not, the Normans would still be in their own country. She reached out and touched his risen penis. This was probably forbidden by the church, not part of her married duty, but she did not care. She was curious. She had seen dogs do it, but never humans, though she had heard them, and in that moment she remembered her mother's shooing her off before she saw too much. He responded by moving her hand onto it, and then by wrapping his arms around her. The boat rolled and rocked as she became liquid beneath his caresses, his soft kisses on her breasts, his stroking, sucking, and touching. In the distance, she could hear the sailors' voices, the plashing of their oars on the water, their shouts, and the clanking of a cooking pot. Then he was gently removing her shift, and she was as naked as him. "Now we are equal," he said. "Believe me when I say that you are lovely, Gunhild. I promise I shall try not to hurt you." He lifted her hips and gently entered her, not from behind as the hounds in the hall yard did, but facing her and right into that place her monthly courses flowed from. She felt her body rip apart. "Hush," he said as she cried out. Then she was moving and sliding in rhythm with him. Somewhere distant, out on the water, seagulls were screaming, and she felt her own call rise from the depths of her throat. "Hush, my love." His voice melted into her. She managed to control her cry. He reassured her. "No one will listen, nor would they care. You are my wife, Gunhild. But I care." "It is not seemly," she whispered tearfully. "You are my wife. I say it is seemly." Afterwards he pulled the sheepskin rug over them both. "Next time it will be in a proper bed with fine linen, and I shall give you a morning gift." "What would that be, my lord?" He caressed her naked breast. A castle or a manor." She removed his hand and turned to look straight into his eyes. I would prefer new gowns and shoes and mantles, clothing I have never owned. Things I have longed for. I need inks and paper and books too. He silenced her. All these will be yours as soon as it can be arranged. Now, sleep. She dozed in his arms, too tired to pay attention to the aching in her groin, the moisture on her thighs, and the hymen blood that streaked them. As she fell towards dreaming, she heard him say to her, "You are my mermaid of the seas, a sea creature to grace my ship." She tried to speak, but words seemed trapped in her throat. She could not reply. Somewhere beyond the rocking boat, seabirds screeched, as if to warn her that all would not be as it seemed. When she awoke, a thin light penetrated the gap in the curtain. It must be afternoon. She pushed herself up. Alan was not by her side, but Anne was sitting on one of the stools with a piece of mending in her lap. The woman stood up, leaning against the wall of the vessel to steady herself. "My lady, you should eat. I can bring you something." Gunhild nodded, though she felt queasy. It was possible that the cause of the nausea she felt was hunger. After all, she had not eaten anything for hours. Her clothes had been neatly placed on the small table, not the silk overdress, but a plain gown from her linen bag. Embarrassed, she clutched the cover about her to protect her modesty and looked with a question at Anne. "My gown?" Anne said, "You will ruin that silk you were wearing on this ship. I put it away." Gunhild nodded and pulled on everything Anne gave her, the plain hempen gown she had worn leaving Wilton and the serviceable linen cap under which she tucked all her hair, tying it tightly under her chin. Anne ducked out of the opening. Gunhild was lacing her boots when she returned with a bowl of soup and a hunk of rough bread. "It is not much, but it will stave off hunger." Anne began to fidget. She was frowning, her eyes darkened. Gunhild wondered what she had done to cause such anxiety. "What is it?" she asked, as she reached for the bowl and began to drink the thin gruel. Anne's face paled as she whispered, "My lady, the water is very still. The light is strange. 2. Everyone is gazing into the horizon as if the beast himself is set to emerge from it. There is fear in their eyes." Gunhild thrust the bowl back into the woman's hand and pulled the sea cape from its hook. Dragging it about her shoulders, she pushed past Anne and out through the heavy curtain. Out on the deck, Alan was watching the sky and talking anxiously to the captain. His soldiers were gloomily staring out to sea. The oarsmen were resting their heads on their forearms. Their faces reflected the same dark anxiety she had seen on the soldiers' faces, the same as was on Anne's. She reached out and touched Alan's arm. He turned round. "Gunhild, go into the shelter. There will be a storm. We cannot outrun it, and we must not row closer to the coast, lest we are dashed against the rocks before we reach Honfleur. This is the way of it. Calm first, but the devil comes with his winds. Get back under the shelter and pray. Pray we are kept safe." His eyes were fearful. "Pray for deliverance." "How can you tell? The sea is so still." "Look into the horizon." Gunhild followed his eyes. The sea was flat, so flat that it looked like the watery lowlands around Glastonbury Abbey, a place remembered from when, as a child, they had visited the west, and the ship, like the abbey itself, was becalmed in a silty pool. "Look again," he said. Clouds seemed to push the vessel deeper into the sea. It was too still. She glanced up at the sky. The seagulls of earlier had vanished. They were the only living creatures above water, on an exposed ship on a huge sea. "Saint Bridget protect us," she said. Count Alan grasped her hand. "Do not fear." She heard the captain's roar of, "Drop the sails." The sky blackened and the sea began to stir. The sailors rushed to the mast and struggled desperately with the sail, managing to drag it down just in time, stumbling and falling over each other as they tried to fold it and finally tie it to the ship's floor. The wind began to push through the sky, causing the boat to shake from side to side, tossing it upwards. Was God punishing her for her sin? Alan dropped her hands. A sailor close to her looked up from the great sail and called out, "Mermaid's curse!" And a streak of yellow lightning crossed the sky. "Get into the shelter now," Count Alan thundered. "Do as I say, Gunhild." She struggled backwards as the prow of the ship rose up again and again. It was as if it were being pushed from beneath by a conspiracy of sea creatures determined to toss them into the turbulent depths below. Suddenly she thought, "I can't swim if we go down. I won't have time to swim. The sea will snatch us like a giant long-necked goose reaching for its dinner, and we are all going to drown." A feeling of panic gripped her. She clutched the curtain that protected the shelter. As water swilled about her ankles, she looked back towards the sea. It was coming over the boat's walls. It was coming for them. There was another lurch as the boat rose and fell, and she was thrown inside the cabin. Anne grabbed her arm and stopped her, crashing into the ash planks of the wall. "Hold on to those iron rings," she yelled above the storm's banging. "And pray." Tossed onto the soaking plank floor, they both clung to the iron rings that lined the wall of the shelter. The ship reeled and reeled over and over, again and again. Water poured from the deck around their knees. She could hear Alan calling to the sailors to scoop it up and bail it out. But still the sea swirled around them, catching at their gowns, drenching them through. Gunhild clung on to the iron ring for her life, fearing all the time that it would rip away from the side. The water kept gushing in. No amount of swimming would save her now. If the ship capsized, she would not survive. None of them would. They would be dashed on to the rocks, lost forever, dropped into the devil's cauldron from the middle of the sea. The ship would break up, and they would all die. "Lady Mary, save us," she prayed over and over. "Saint Bridget, hear my prayers. Save us." Every time the ship leapt up, Anne called out, "God spare us." Her voice was lost because of the thundering noise outside the cabin. The ship continued to heave and rock. Alan yelled above the storm at his men to lash themselves to their posts. There was nothing more after that but the heaving, creaking, and shouting, and Anne's mumbling of paternosters. Gunhild clung to the iron ring, trying to think herself somewhere else, in the garden at Wilton, safe in her own chamber in the postulant's building, in the scriptorium, talking about her dreams to Eleanor, and as a child at Raridfell before, the great battle that had destroyed her father. Night began to fall, and as suddenly as the storm had begun, the waves started to become quieter, the sea more of a roll. The vessel was still tossing about, but the wind was gradually dying down. Eventually the vessel stilled, and she felt the sailors begin to row. Anne stood up and told Gunhild to stay in the shelter. She reached for the hanging and flung herself through it. "Find my lord!" Gunhild cried out after her. After a while, when Count Alan came to the cabin, Gunhild was wringing out her dress. She tried to stand up, but he told her to sit. He lifted her damp mantle, placed it around her, and handed her a cup of heated wine. "Drink this. It will steady your nerves. We shall be in Honfleur by daybreak. We have the fire up again. When you are ready, come out and get dry. We have a ship to get into port. I want to make sure there is no further danger to us. Such a storm can blow enemies up into our waters." His voice was soldierly. He was concise, determined, and lacking emotion, a warrior steering them all to safety. With that, he was gone. She gulped down the spiced wine, feeling it warm her stomach. As she leaned back against the planks, too tired to care about anything, a wave of nausea overpowered her. She pulled herself to her feet and stumbled through the curtain into the air away from the fetid shelter. Once outside, she leaned over one of the leather buckets used to bail out seawater and retched until she thought there was nothing left to lose from her stomach except her insides. Too ill to warm herself by the charcoal fire, she crawled back into the shelter, collapsed onto the couch, and pulled a damp sheepskin over her, thinking that she had survived the storm only to appear cowardly, weak and useless in front of the soldiers. Anne returned with a cup of water and wiped her mouth. There was a dry blanket in a chest. She warmed it by the brazier and wrapped it around Gunhild. "You are as white as a shroud, my lady. I hope he is not planning to make you ride when we reach shore." Gunhild clutched her stomach again and squeezed the words out between her teeth. "If my lord insists, then I must." Anne made a clicking sound of disapproval, but otherwise kept silent. Gunhild tried to think of a warm room, a fire and the company of women. She thought of the colorful letters she had illustrated and imagined her unfinished miniature of the wedding at Cana, with its pretty acanthus leaves climbing around a pillar and the handsome Jesus who turned water to wine. The picture distracted her until at last they heard shouts of port and land, the sound of the sail lowering again, seagulls cawing, the thumping of feet around her and calls of "pull into the jetty." There was a great rattling, and after it a jolt. Alan pushed his head into the shelter. "We must disembark first, Gunhild. Since we are now lord and lady, you will smile for them all, no matter how you feel. We shall lead a procession of sailors to the church of St. Matthew and give thanks for our deliverance. Afterwards we ride to Bayeux. I have business there." He saw her look of dismay and frowned. "It is a 2.5 days' ride into Brittany." His tone was brusque. As Anne adjusted Gunhild's mantle about her shoulders, she said, "Poor lady, he is a soldier and unaccustomed to a woman's needs." Gunhild ignored Anne's words and instead turned away from her, throwing a frown in the woman's direction first. She was a princess after all, her great father's daughter, so she raised her head, gritted her teeth, and followed Alan onto the deck.